Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into something absolutely fascinating: Yue Fei and the Song Dynasty's immune system. The death of General Yue Fei is, without a doubt, one of the most heartbreaking tragedies in Chinese history, right? But you know what's really wild when you look back at it? It's not just the fabricated charges that got him killed. It's the sheer ease of it all. The court, led by Qin Hui, managed to imprison and execute this universally beloved national hero with practically zero effort. It's like the system just swallowed him whole. So how on earth did that actually happen? Let's get into it. Okay, to really understand this, we need to completely reframe what we think we know. Let me ask you a question, and really think about this. Why was a beloved national hero executed without sparking a single military revolt? I mean, why did his fiercely loyal military just stay quiet? No social chaos, no massive uprising. The answer actually isn't just about a paranoid emperor or some scheming ministers. It's way bigger than that. What we're actually looking at is a massive systemic collision, a violent crash between Emperor Zhaogu's extreme historical paranoia and Yue Fei literally, though unintentionally, stepping on the absolute biggest landmine of the Song dynasty's foundational policy. Which brings us to part 1, the terrifying imprint of the 5 dynasties. To really get inside Emperor Zhaogu's head, we have to talk about the deeply embedded genetic trauma of the Song dynasty itself. Think of the phrase innocent evil. It's a brutal paradox, right? But it perfectly captures the casual, almost entertainment-like cruelty of the warlords during the dark century of the 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms. I mean, before the Song dynasty even existed, warlords essentially ran completely wild. Murdering an emperor? Treated like child's play. Looting and slaughtering civilians? Completely random and terrifyingly barbaric. It was the total collapse of order. And this absolute nightmare literally terrified the founders of the Song dynasty. It's exactly what shaped their absolute non-negotiable highest national policy, preventing military rule literally at all costs. So, tracking this over time, this kind of extreme paranoia doesn't just happen overnight. In the early 10th century, you've got this sheer warlord chaos. Then, by the late 10th century, the Song dynasty founders deliberately designed their entire government, like using wine at banquets to politely strip generals of their commands, or forcing civil servants to oversee the military, specifically to dilute military power. They were terrified of a repeat. But here's the kicker for Emperor Zhaogu in the early 12th century. This wasn't just some dusty history lesson for him, it was his living reality. He personally survived the Jingkong incident, where the capital fell and his royal family was captured. He knew firsthand exactly how horrific things get when internal order completely falls apart. Let's move to part 2, activating the Song's immune system. Now we can look at the pathogen and our systemic diagnosis. How did a wildly successful general accidentally trigger a massive political allergic reaction? Well, Yue Fei essentially crossed a massive, glowing red line. He went from being a highly effective military tool to an independent political force. He and his sons were unbelievably successful on the battlefield, gaining unmatched prestige. And sure, that's fantastic for defending the borders, but to the system's architects, that is a blaring alarm bell. Because he wasn't just fighting battles anymore, he started deeply intervening in royal succession, actually giving opinions on who should be the heir. He was trying to heavily influence major national policies. And most dangerously of all, he was fostering an army that operated on this terrifying concept where the troops belonged primarily to the general, not the state. So, driven by that traumatic historical memory we talked about, the court's political immune system woke up. It didn't see a loyal, patriotic general. Instead, it coldly identified a structural anomaly, a literal cancer cell that had to be eradicated to protect the state. To Emperor Zhaogu and his ministers, it really didn't matter how pure Yue Fei's motives were. When you combined his massive personal influence, his fiercely loyal army, and his active political participation, he looked like a complete existential threat to the Song's core doctrine of civilian rule. The system ruthlessly, mechanically purged him to ensure its own survival. Moving to part 3, the fundamental divide, general versus emperor. Because the conflict actually goes even deeper than just political paranoia. It hits a fundamental disagreement about the survival of the civilian population. There was just a massive clash in how these two men viewed survival. General Yue Fei looked at the world completely through the lens of external conquest. His metrics were military victory, battlefield dominance, and keeping army morale high. He was a lifelong military man, right? So his ultimate loyalty was always to the battlefield. But this hyper-focus on the military often meant he overlooked the grueling, day-to-day suffering of the lower-class citizens. Emperor Zhaogu, on the other hand, viewed survival entirely through civil management. His focus was restoring social order and preventing internal rebellion. As the ruler, Zhao simply couldn't ignore the general populace. He was the manager of the entire social structure. To the Sung court, a massive, unchecked military apparatus that was constantly pushing for endless war, that was terrifying. It threatens their fragile civil order and meant draining resources, which leads to starving populations. There's an old saying, generals can kill, but desperate peasants can kill too. Zhao and his ministers knew for a fact that the true root cause of a dynasty's downfall isn't always an invading army, it's the accumulation of refugees, famine, and internal social conflict. So, to maintain any kind of stable society, they felt they desperately needed meticulous civil management and absolute strict checks on military power. Which brings us to part 4, cruel choice, order versus merit. This underlying ideological divide over public suffering essentially forced Emperor Zhao into a ruthless triage decision. Ultimately, Yue Fei wasn't just the victim of a paranoid emperor's fabricated charges. He was a structural sacrifice, a systemic necessity required by a government that prioritized internal civilian survival over military expansion. Yue Fei was aggressively, passionately pursuing military victory, but Zhao absolute non-negotiable baseline was restoring internal order. So when Yue Fei's military goals began to threaten the internal stability that Zhao so desperately needed to maintain, the emperor made his choice. He sacrificed the general. It's an incredibly ruthless decision made by a ruler placing systemic stability above literally everything else. It's a sobering reminder, really, that sometimes brilliant individuals aren't crushed by cackling villains, but by the cold, mechanical needs of a self-preserving system. So I'll leave you with a final thought to mull over. External threat or internal order? Which do you choose? If saving the nation from external threats means risking the complete collapse of its internal order, which path would a true ruler take? Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope it gave you a whole new lens to view this incredibly complex piece of history.